Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Mobilidade é vida. Somos a CCR. Estamos presentes em 13 estados brasileiros e em outros 3 países. Unidos por um único propósito: melhorar a vida das pessoas através da mobilidade. A inovação sustentável nos aponta a direção, as necessidades de nossos clientes, as oportunidades. Valorizamos os encontros. Valorizamos a vida.
Caixa, o banco com milhões de clientes que sempre tem um olhar especial para quem mais importa, você. É por você que tem nos benefícios sociais a esperança para superar os desafios. É por você que tem direito à moradia digna e quer realizar o sonho da casa própria. É por um país que acredita na união e reconstrução, com mais diversidade, sustentabilidade e muitas oportunidades. Caixa, é por você, é por um novo Brasil.
Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, O Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional SESC. Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
This year, we're going to have a lot of poetry in Flip. Pagu, amongst all of her 1,000 Pagus, multifaceted, she was a poet. And we're going to have Augusto de Campos is our artist. We're going to have a surprise. We're going to see an excerpt from a special meeting that happened last week, which was recorded, and you're going to see it for the first time this evening. A meeting between Caetano Veloso and Augusto de Campos. And Caetano says that he considers for him Caetano the greatest living poet that we have in Brazil. This possibility of occupying the public spaces with culture is dear to our hearts. Literature in its expanded field, which includes and encompasses all arts, it has proven to be an interesting form of having people acknowledge and recognize their places, the place which they inhabit, the place that they give meaning to, and only literature can make this activation together with the other arts. Poetry has a very important relationship with the dimension of the imaginary and dreams. This is essential. How can we, in such a difficult moment that we're experiencing now, the world with war-torn, how important it is to have this dimension of poetry in our lives, to be able to create empathy among people. for us to be able to go back to having the towns and the town squares as a place of exchange, meeting, and experiences. This dimension, which is very dear to us, it also activates an idea, which is the idea of the encounter between people in the dimension of real in the embodied world, where new technology is a novelty, brings us illusion that only the relations mediated by technology can replace the real world. And we believe that it's not exactly like that. That's not exactly the case. We're going to have the presence here of the Brazilianist and researcher David Jackson, and he is launching as a wonderful thing, which is a very consistent work, the first volume of an extremely consistent work on Pagu. And in the middle, there's something which called our attention, an article that Pagu wrote on Leute, the newspaper, during the Second World War, and in which she gave a reply to an article written by Mario de Andrade. Mario de Andrade was letting off steam. He said the world, and if the world is at war, why literature? And Pagu defended, saying the following, it's precisely at such times that we most need the art and of literature and poetry. Towards which possible futures do the winds lead us to dream? This is by Italo Calvino. And a word, I wish you all that you enjoy this possibility of experiencing, and that these encounters that are going to happen here in authors with authors that we're going to see here, and authors with their public and the readership in this auditorium, and the several different, we have 200 different partner institutions in these various spaces that make FLIP happen. FLIP is a myriad, a collective construction, which is very unique. And so we hope and believe that this experience will be very fruitful for you all in these difficult times we're experiencing, for us to be able to imagine futures which we can share.
Então,
So,
todos,
I wish you all a wonderful FLIP. May everyone have the best possible experience. And I would like to call on to the stage one of the curators. This year we have Milena Brito and Fernanda Basto as the curators.
Quem vai apresentar essa mesa
introduction
é a
to this
Fernanda
roundtable is going to be Fernanda
Bastos. Por favor,
Bastos.
Fernanda.
So, Fernanda, please come forward onto the stage.
Então é com muita alegria que a gente inicia essa edição, saudando a todas, todos e todes, e chamando já, para falar da nossa homenageada, Patrícia Galvão a Pagu, essa mesa tão esperada que vai ser conduzida pela professora Eneida Leal Cunha, e que vai ter, então, o David Jackson e a Adriana Armony. Então, eu chamo a professora Eneida aqui para o palco para a gente iniciar essa discussão. Obrigada.
Thank you very much.
Boa noite.
Good evening, good evening. May we?
Podemos, né?
We may.
Boa noite.
Good evening.
Bem-vindos.
Welcome.
O primeiro dia é sempre pouco agitado para nós chegarmos aqui. As demandas de Paraty, do coquetel, são muitas. Com muita alegria que eu estou nesta mesa que vai homenagear uma figura, veremos isso depois, ao longo de uma hora, muito peculiar da nossa história cultural,
feminista
e acompanhada por duas pessoas que recentemente fizeram contribuições muito valiosas para tornar a Pagu real para nós. Nós temos o professor David Jackson, da Universidade de Yale, há 40 anos. Ele me disse há pouco que preferia ser chamado de David ou Davi. Há 40 anos, o professor se dedica às literaturas em língua portuguesa e às singularidades culturais da pós-colonialidade do antigo Império Lusitano. Desde a sua tese de doutorado, em 73, sobre Jorge de Sena, estudou poetas de Portugal e do Brasil. Traduziu para inglês os romances Parque Industrial, de Patrícia Galvão, e Serafim Ponte Grande, de Oswald de Andrade. É um destacado e singular pesquisador do modernismo brasileiro, porque tem escolhido como foco de trabalho as zonas de sombra da história da literatura brasileira. As zonas de sombra é uma expressão, é um conceito, é um diagnóstico que eu aprendi com as feministas. A zona de sombra é onde ficam aquelas coisas que nós vemos, não porque elas foram silenciadas. Ninguém foi silenciado. Nós aqui não ouvimos ou não vemos muitas coisas tão próximas. Então, nessas zonas de sombra, por exemplo, que o professor Jackson, no seu trabalho com o modernismo, escolheu Pagu. Né? No momento, o professor David Jackson finaliza 2 trabalhos de fôlego dedicados à nossa homenageada. Um deles, aliás, foi lançado ontem em São Paulo. Nós ainda não pegamos, mas ele vai mostrar aqui, é um belíssimo volume. Palavras de Rebeldia, uma antologia do jornalismo de Patrícia Galvão, editado pela Edusp. E Jornalismo de Patrícia Galvão, em 4 volumes. Pagu e a Política, Arte e Literatura, Teatro Contemporâneo e Grandes Autores Mundiais. É autor de vários outros livros, destaco os mais próximos. Machado de Assis, Vida Literária, de 2015. Antologia Oxford do Conto Brasileiro, de 2006. Haroldo de Campos, com diálogo com o concretismo, 2005. Principalmente, o professor Jackson é autor do recente Anjos Canibais, Modernismo Transatlântico e Vanguarda Brasileira, de 21, ainda não traduzido entre nós, que explora a interação entre artistas visuais,
writers and musicians, Latin, Brazilian and European artists to create the modern style that shaped Brazilian literature in the national imaginary a century ago. Here next to me, I have, sitting next to me, the writer, Adriana Armony. She was born in Rio de Janeiro several years after the death of Pagu in 1972. She's a professor at the Pedro II School, a PhD in comparative literature from the Federal University in Rio, and a postdoc at Sorbonne Nouvelle in 2019, from 2019 to 2020, with research called A Woman as a Profession, Pagu in Paris. She published last year a novel, Pagu in the Subway, which narrates the circulation of the young political militant and journalist in Paris, and they're woven with the daily routine of the research, who is living there to research in archives of the police and political organizations the records of the Pagu's presence in Paris. Adriana and Pagu circulate on the streets and the underground of Paris, and amongst them their flows and our contrast experiences of women with almost a century between them. Confidences, research, and fiction are mixed, but the result is not biography nor autobiography. It is rather a daring witness to diverse lives. Adriana Armony has written other novels. Nelson's Hunger, I invent the episode of Nelson Rodriguez in his youth when he had tuberculosis. He was living in Campo de Jordão. He wrote his first play. Adriana's PhD thesis in 2002 was on Nelson Rodriguez, the playwright. In the Country of the Future does fiction inspired by a close history. Her paternal grandmother who migrated from Palestine after the First World War. The most recent novel, let's call her Maria, a white woman, a middle-class woman, reads news about another woman, a black and poor woman, victim, rape, and she imagines her interweaving her erotic and amorous experiences in the frightening nights of enslavement. Adriana writes books about books. She writes words based on words. She wants to make history based on her fictions. So these are our guest authors here this evening. This is a panel with a peculiar title. I decided to do I'm going to read a brief thoughts. I promise that it'll be brief because controlling our time on Pagu, especially concerning the woman of the people, Pagu, a title of the roundtable. And I circulated in these last few days. I found that intrigued people. Why? The woman of the people. We've read in several sources that Pagu was revered in this flip. She had ties to the modernist movements, or she was a featured highlight in the modernist movement. Vague words. There are no details, either the ties or the bears, with some details from her life. We know little about Pagu. Diffuse ideas about her artistic contribution to the modernism, almost nothing about her political life, and very little is read about her journalism. Certainly we've seen a photograph of Pagu, a beautiful young woman, well-defined mouth and eyes, disorder her body and her hair, deep green in her body, deep depths, and challenging, daring cliffs. We've read few writings of hers, unfortunately. We understand very little about what she meant to say. One of them is in the title of this roundtable, Pagu, the woman of the people. From her writings, colloquially, the woman of the people is a prejudiced word, discriminating when said by prejudiced people, or it marks distance, even when the distance is in solidarity, the distance between the person who speaks and the woman about whom one speaks. It's she, the woman of the people. But the expression, the woman of the people, marks Pagu's entry, a blue-blood woman in the discursive order of modernism in the 1930s. We should always recall that despite her early biographies, she was born in 1910. She was only 12 years old when the Week of Modern Art, she didn't participate in it. She was a student of Mater de Andrade at 17 years of age, and she approached the strong core of modernism the following year, in 1928. In 1929, she published some drawings in Anthropophagia, and the next year, Pagu and Oswald de Andrade were married, and they joined the Brazilian Communist Party. In 1931, Pagu and her husband launched the weekly journal, The Man of the People, which lasted 2 months and had 8 editions in them. Pagu published a series of articles in the section entitled The Woman of the People. These articles are fully included in Professor Jackson's book. Going to the people was the challenge for the Leninist revolutionary intellectuals from that time. Vladimir Mayakovsky quotes the commitments of the engaged artists, engaged with the proletariat, ethical and political integrity, exercising the mission of a cultural agitator, and to create an experimental aesthetic, an innovative aesthetic. This was the orientation of the proletarian novels, therefore, for composing the Industrial Park, published by Pagu, without any repercussions amongst the critics in 1933, with no repercussions amongst the critics at all in 1933. Weighing against her proletarian novel, woman, although it was a pseudonym, the gender diction that focused on women, the blue-class women, the women of the people, extreme poverty, boundless workforce in the factories, indecorous and multiple harassment against their bodies. The intersection between gender and class, as we say today, was repudiated by the Brazilian Communist Party, to which Pagu still belonged, and did not captivate the literates, the intellectuals of modernism. In the newspaper in February that same year, 1933, Pagu wrote, "Despite Carnival being the topic of the day, we haven't seen any noise or confetti or particularly samba-oriented interviews. We went to see on the hillsides the reality in the cat skin stretched over the tambourines and the cuica as it was played with the percussion. Pagu, her life, her work, and libertarian utopias was a sonorous voice in modernism, differing greatly from her peers who had to discover Brazil, bringing to the news pages the cultural contributions of the raped populations. She could not have been a tourist apprentice. She didn't want the cultural wealth of black music to make her Brazilian. She wanted, as we have just read, she wanted to see on the hillsides the reality down the throats and the skin on the tambourine, or the shout of the cuica. Her revolutionary instinct towards others she never abandoned it. What she had was antennas were sensitive, anticipatory, recommending to her modernist peers, for example, in a long article from 1945, that it was necessary to read, it was necessary to pay close attention to Lima Barreto's thinking, the black Brazilian novelist, shunned by the intellectuals. With this introduction to Pagu and the woman of the people, so we're going to turn the floor over to, and I think that you've already been informed, to our joy. We have 60 minutes for this session because in the opening session there are no questions and answers so we're happy about that. So we're going to begin with a question, which is the question that all of you would like to ask, I would imagine. It's a question that we always ask, something that instigates all readers of any book and any kind of study and research. Why Pagu? It's a question that I would like for you to understand, that she is before the books, she's before her work, she's before her novels. It's how you reached Pagu. Why did you choose Pagu at a certain moment in your work, in your careers, in your lives? This is an initial question for Adriana and Professor Jackson. Should I begin? Please do. So, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a huge joy to participate in this flip with this tribute to Pagu, this emblematic, multiple, fascinating woman, and so contemporary next to this daring pioneer writer, David Jackson, and with our luxurious assistance from Eneida. So I'm very happy to be here. Why Pagu? I could say that Pagu was a woman ahead of her time, but I would prefer to say that she is ahead of our time also. Ahead in the sense that she is part of the struggle, the feminist struggle, the political struggle, and the courage of thinking. She was a woman who had courage to change her own mind, who was brave enough to think differently, first differently from the patterns and standards to which she was submitted. She suffered as a consequence a number of restrictions, imprisonments, arrests, contradictions, harassment, a woman who desired to free herself and dedicate herself to something bigger than herself. Also, a woman who suffered all the contradictions of feminism from its origins, contradictions which to this day we recognize. Years after her, as an adolescent, I lived and still experienced similar contradictions, because in our desire to free ourselves of certain standards, oftentimes we fall into a view, a male view. In other words, free yourself of your shackles, but to serve the male view. So this touched me deeply in Pagu. I'm going to talk about my several different encounters with Pagu, but first I wanted to answer why Pagu. That was to get the ball rolling. Thank you very much, Adriana. Professor David? First of all, I need to acknowledge it's an honor truly to have this invitation from Flip, the possibility to be here and to share with Eneida and Adriana, whose book I admire greatly. How did I discover Pagu? There are many Pagus. I think that we all have to rediscover the various different Pagus that exist. In my own case, I began doing a PhD thesis on Oswald de Andrade, and I came to Brazil in 1971 in Brazilian studies to study this thesis, and I discovered Pagu as one of the women that Oswald loved so much. And when I discovered Industrial Park Industrial, it was unknown. There wasn't much material about Oswald, much less about Pagu, and I saw a footnote in a literary journal, Industrial Park, and I was curious, Park Industrial. So I asked a colleague who was in São Paulo to send me a Xerox copy of the Maria Andrade library. So I read this in 1977, and with Elizabeth we began to prepare the translation of this novel until 1993. Hold the microphone closer. So this translation, thank you very much. Finally, it was published in 1993, so we had the possibility of learning about Pagu through Park Industrial, Industrial Park. I use this in my classes whenever I read Industrial Park. This reveals other facets and wonderful facets about from the female characters, social critique, Pauliceia, in several different chapters, the institutions. This work is one of the great novels of modernism. Industrial Park, in the first study that I did in 1977, considered this novel. I called Pagu one of the great intellectual figures, Brazilian intellectual figures of the 20th century. So I believe that it's a work that I was able to do about her later confirmed this idea that the more we learn about Pagu, the several different studies on Pagu, and now her journalism, the more I respect her because of her intellectual strength and her critique and her original nature, that her consistency and solidarity, which we see through, especially through her journalism and her other writings. So I was extremely happy to have reached this point with Pagu. After learning about Industrial Park and before her interest in journalism, I didn't know there was so much to learn about her. A series of columns led to another. I began this collection in 1990, and approximately I finished it in 2010. So since then, I've been waiting for the publication, and very fortunately helped by Flip, the tribute to Pagu. So this led to the existence of this anthology that was launched yesterday. So I'm still learning more about more Pagus, and I hope that you too can learn as much as myself. Thank you very much, Professor David Jackson. The writings on Pagu, bringing you to this pen, result from intellectual projects, especially authorial projects, almost diametrically opposed. On one hand, the work on the archival researchers who publishes documents on the Pagu's journalistic activity that are difficult to access and hard to access, beautiful work and curatorship without a shadow of a doubt. And obviously, like all curatorship, the sequence of articles are the narrative. On the other hand, instigating a literary work which offers us visions of Pagu in Paris in 1934, Pagu in the subway, in the metro, imagination and writing. I would like to ask you to Professor Jackson first, then Adriana, how the access to the archives, and Adriana, how the fictional presentification can contribute to bring to current readers this complex and challenging woman, this woman who is so far and so close to us. In short, I would like for you to talk a little bit about the projects, about what precedes the books, or preceded the books, and to describe a little bit, especially Professor Jackson, who just launched his anthology. And if he doesn't do this, I'm going to do it myself, because I had to do the work of telling how many journals were researched and the time that he spent, and total 600 pages fully occupied by Pagu's words. Would you like to begin, Professor Jackson? Yes, I can begin. Perhaps something new in the anthology, bibliography, which shows us how many studies and the references were done on Pagu. I myself could never have imagined that there would be 20 pages of references, books, newspaper articles concerning Pagu. So this increased the interest. There's a growing interest in her work and her articles and her writings. It's a huge joy to see all of that. Now, in the anthology, this kind of work, obviously, I had the help of many people. The São Paulo archives, numerous researchers, de Santos, Poeta de Santos, he Xeroxed columns from Tribuna de Santos. He sent me packages of Xerox copies, and people helped me with the typewriting the originals as well, which is a painstaking work and intense. Now, on the other hand, you have to pick text from the archives, but when we read the writings, we discover, as somebody suggested, we can read these writings almost like novels. Not her kind, like Adriana's novel, but the quality. There's always a narrative voice, Pagu's narrative voice, who speaks to the readers. This is a literary structure itself. The thematics change frequently and present very different features of the author, which are literary, have literary characters. It's no coincidence that we know her, so to speak, with her pen name. She used a lot of different pen names. Her columns had one pen name, and her articles had other pen names. She may have seen her as a kind of social theater. In this sense, journalism has these dimensions and creative. So it's something perhaps that we have in common in this work, in reclaiming and retrieving the discovery of Pagu as an author. I'd like to tell a little bit about the story of my encounters with Pagu. My first encounter with Pagu, I think it was everyone's encounter with that Pagu, emblematic Pagu, with Pagu, with her red lipstick, very daring and saucy, a militant activist, outraged on the stage. She's a pop Pagu, Rita Lee's Pagu, Norma Bengal's film, and a fascinating figure. But this was not the most important encounter that I had with her. The most important encounter was the second encounter with Pagu, which was when I read her early autobiography under Paixão Pagu. In this early autobiography, the letter that she writes to Geraldo de Ferraz when she was in prison, a very moving, amazing letter. And we can see another Pagu. Pagu, there was a mistake. This mistake was very clear. It was equivocal when we read, because she was baptized by Raul Bopp because he thought that her name was Patrícia Goulart, not Patrícia Galvão. So this baptism, so to speak, this equivocal baptism characterizes this emblem full of contradictions. And that's where, when we read this letter, where she is totally sincere, very moving, touching, in her sincerity, she tells her experiences all the way from her 12 years when she had her first sexual experience. In her own words, and this possession provoked me. I didn't feel any pleasure. This idea, interjected idea, that this rape had been she provoked the rape herself, and several other moments which we don't recognize. We end up not recognize the libertarian Pagu. Not that she had this desire of liberation, of delivering herself unto something bigger, and breaking with the limits and the standards, but she was submitted to all of these contradictions of her time, contradictions which persist to this day. So this letter touched me. This was just one episode, and the letter continues talking about her relationship with Osvaldo. Although she admired him greatly, she also had various different issues with him. Which had to do with the structural chauvinism in Osvaldo, inevitably. And the letter is interrupted when she reaches the Soviet Union. She narrates her trip, which she calls it the round journey, when she goes to the United States and then she goes to China. She ends up introducing soybeans into Brazil because Raul Bopp asked her to bring soybeans back to plant. She was important even in soybeans in Brazil. And the letter stops when she reaches, which is in the Soviet Union, and she says, talks about Stalin, our leader and our head, and in Paris, it doesn't exist. I thought to myself, what happened? This part in Paris was like effaced. It's not part of the letter. So the novelist, imagine, begins to take flight. Pagu burned the letter. There's some secret in the letter. Wasn't she able? She suffered violence and she wasn't able to narrate them. The fact is that we know that Paris was extremely important for Pagu. She had contact with surrealists. She was an activist under Léonie Boucher, her pen name there, her pseudonym. Her taste for surrealism has its roots in Paris. In her articles, we can see that she praises various different Nesco and various different French surrealists and authors. This awakened my desire to learn what happened with Pagu in the time she spent in Paris. So I went as a researcher. I asked permission from this section where I worked to do my postdoc to do this research, but I suspected that I wasn't going to do just research. I was going to of course, I was going to have fun in Paris, obviously, but this research would bring other echoes, and that's what actually happened. So I began with this project, which Eneida mentioned about the woman as a profession, which is a joke with Oswald, who has an autobiography, was a man without a profession under his mother's orders. She was a woman with a profession under the orders of the Communist Party. It was somewhat in this sense. And that's where, when I began to do the research, it was sort of I could possibly not find anything, but fortunately I found a lot of material. I found her police file, and I wasn't able to, in the police archives, and there's this archival work which is painstaking and fascinating. It's when we take that archive and we touch that, there's that feeling of the real, that it actually happened. It's really moving. It's awesome. And I found her police file in another archive, because these archives were shifted around from one place to another during the Second World War. They was taken to Moscow later when France was liberated. At the end of the Second World War, they stayed there in the Perestroika, and they came back to France, and they'd never been opened at all. And I took the file. I found her police file, I opened it up, and there's a little envelope, a closed envelope, sealed envelope. I didn't know if I could open it up, the envelope, and I looked back. Should I ask anybody? I'm not going to ask people for permission. They may tell me I can. So I opened the envelope, and I found this photograph, which is a photograph which is in the Pagu, in the subway, which is this photograph where she has this challenging, young, beautiful gaze. And it was awesome, very moving. And this was an encounter which marked me profound. And I'm not going to tell the whole story. I've been telling too much, but an encounter with in archives at the hospitals in Paris when she was hospitalized in late 1934. And with this encounter, other encounters emerged. And these are the encounters of the imaginary. These are the mirrors of my experience with Pagu's experience, her experience, and that of the women who are in the archives, which I read some of the episodes of her and Pagu, and Violette Nozier, who was a woman who galvanized the surrealist because of a crime. She was defended by the realists, and I could imagine myself that Pagu was there during Violette Nozier's trial, who was an amazing woman. And these mirrorings peopled my book. The book is a journey, a trajectory. I found the book's structure when I imagined that she was a flâneuse, a person who was wandering on the streets in the archives, but especially in the imaginaries, who are mine, those of Pagu, and those of women in general. Professor, would you like to read a few excerpts, brief excerpts from your book? These excerpts, before I do the reading, I wish to mention Brás Cubas is in this anthology. I had the pleasure to meet Geraldo Guerrão Ferraz, Pagu's son. He spent 2 years in New York when he was concluding the organization of the anthology and all the material. And I showed Geraldo, and he wrote a preface exactly for this anthology, unbeknownst to us, or if it was even going to be published, this preface was written more than 10 years ago by Geraldo, Pagu's son, for this anthology. So it's the Brás Cubas of the anthology that appears here. Fine. So what we learned from Pagu for this anthology, I apologize, but when you read, hold the microphone closer, otherwise we can't hear you. We'll lose you and Pagu, both of you. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so the anthology of journalism ranges from the first columns, her participation in Diário do Povo until late in her life, and it includes various different columns that she published, showing us a person who's extremely young, who lived her life intensely to 30 years of age until 1940, after which she spent a period of almost 20 years reflecting, especially dedicating herself to journalism, commenting on everything that she experienced that had happened with her. So, with this massive journalism, I organized it in 4 volumes, which are going to be published in the University of São Paulo. Pagu is political, not always, but somewhat more in the first phase, after which art and literature, where she shows she's a literary and artistic art critic. The third on world theater. She dedicates in the 1950s to theater, and the fourth volume, the 90 authors in world literature that she presents and translates in the Diário de São Paulo from 1946 to 1948. So these are the 4 watersheds, important watersheds in her work in the anthology. When we read the columns, that she doesn't have a recipe, she writes whatever she wants to, but reading between the lines, we realize we gain, in a certain sense, a portrait. We hear her voice. As Geraldo said, she speaks to the reader. She converses with the readers in friendly tones with the readers. So I have several different excerpts here which illustrate this friendly tone. I'll need my glasses and the microphone as well. Talking about politics, the end of a column, she says, where therefore from the right and the left, totalitarian left that emerges in these gray times, how can we trace the word that leads to the hierarchy of lost values between dictatorships and exacerbated nationalism, unwritten naturalization with the immediate objectives of the parties? Where can we raise the certainty that it's possible and have a third party in the paths of freedom? And this is from 1946. It's a column where she talks about thieves. She ends up saying, I believe that if I were a thief, the problem would not be to steal. It would be what to steal, because in reality, there's nothing that's worth it to steal. What about the adventure when you just try to take something from someone doesn't having some bit of bread with no butter on it? What about stealing bread from the poor? It's a time where she goes back to an island near Santos where she was exiled in 1934 with Oswald, with the same character. She comments, it's a life that flows, the art that remains, and between what leaves and stays, men make their grandeur and their dignity. To talk about these characters is to evoke in this landscape in an intensely lived time the hopes, goodness, love, generous effort which never rewards us, things for which it is still worthwhile to have lived. And she always defended modernism, so at the end of a column she writes in capital letters, another artistic revolution can replace the history in the evolution of our sensitivity and our intelligence. The 1922 revolution, only another big revolution can replace it. Thank you very much, Professor. Would you like to read? Yes, I can read as well. I would just like to make a comment concerning this issue of the modern generation. It's interesting how she opposes the modern representatives to the contemporary. Oftentimes the contemporaries are not modern, because modern is human adventure. It is exploring language, which is an exploration of existence as well. Both of them can be modern, but they aren't always. Sometimes they only repeat and copy each other. And Pagu was a woman who defended adventure. I would like to read here an excerpt of hers from my imaginary encounter. One of my imaginary encounters with Pagu. Then she called me Inspector Armony, which unburied things, unearthed things from my past. Rather, at this moment, we, in the platform on the Republic subway, 2 women see. One is more than 100 years old, the other only half that. The 100-year-old is 52 years old and 24 at the same time. The researcher is also 24 years old. She's almost 22 and 52. In a blink of an eye, she'll be 100 years old. I want to show you a little thing. Follow Patrícia to the end of the platform. She touches behind the construction work, and she's holding a rat by the tail. But what I see is a weapon. The revolver shines in the cold light and the ceiling lights. What kind of weapon is it? It's like in the films. I got it in 1934 when I was guarding the Popular Front, but I've had other weapons at the regional conference in Rio de Janeiro at the time of the Man of the People newspaper. I like shooting. She faces me, but she seemed to see something else in my face. Once in 1938, when Maria Magalhães, was working for the Red Rescue Brigade, what I told him was, I shake my head. Pagu recites, now that I've failed, you can take me to the police because I deserve this punishment. Do you think I'm cynical? And without waiting for the answer, I offer the weapon as a baby in her lap. I refuse. Are you afraid? I reflect a little bit. Yes, I'm afraid. Beyond that, it's not worth it. You're a coward. I talk slowly as if she were a child. Be careful, Pagu. Put the revolver on the ground. It can go off. It can backfire. I said, my name is not Pagu. My name is Patrícia, not Patrícia. What's your name? Guess. Patsy. Mara Loeb. Solange Zaza. Zazie. The woman begins to dance around me with the revolver, laughing and shaking her head one way or another, shaking her head. A shot goes off in the subway. Professor, when we study someone, when we read about someone, when we like to reconstruct somebody, to reclaim a writer, to retrieve an intellectual like Pagu, we begin to have the impression that we have some hypotheses, several hypotheses. I'd like to submit a hypothesis to you. What do you think about that? Can it be that the new journalism, communication, immediate communication, chronicles and articles, and the daily newspapers, the columns and the magazines, isn't there a dynamic which is more favorable for Pagu? The mobility of Pagu's thinking, the mobility of Pagu's attention, rather than books, or as opposed to books. It's an interesting hypothesis because of the amount of journalism. I think it confirms your hypothesis. Geraldo, her son, in the introduction says that when he was growing up, he heard tic-tac, tic-tac in her Olivetti typewriters when they still existed, when typewriters still exist, and then she never stopped writing. It was a constant flow on her typewriter. She never stopped to think about the themes. So in this sense, I think that it shows that Pagu is very journalistic in that sense, but on the other hand, she wrote 2 important novels, Industrial Park, increasingly interesting for our reading, and, well, the Revista, published in 45, written in Rio de Janeiro, in 43 and 44, which, in a certain sense, there was a novel which could have been by Orwell or Huxley. So it condemns the Communist Party. So it's in the competent sense of her first, it's the opposite of her first novel, although also there are characters as well that are very important. But it's a vanguard work because she wrote a chapter, and then the last chapter in the book is another phrase written by them. So I think this shows her dedication to the vanguard and, her interest in more complex novelistic forms. So the idea that journalism itself, with all its extension, is a kind of novel of life. I think it's an interesting proposal. So on this point, to be a journalist. Pagu as a journalist finds her quality as a writer, as a journalist, but we should not forget that she wrote a lot. So this is amazing and impressive. We should take this into account in our idea of Pagu, which in how almost Machado de Assis writes theater. He was a playwright and short stories and the detective stories even, with columns, various different newspaper columns as well, even Machado de Assis. So fortunately, we don't have to give a definitive answer to your question. We shouldn't, but she was a writer, a variable, multiple, and very imaginative and intellectual writer. But what we also see in the anthology, which impressed me and amazed me, is that as being so young, in a certain sense, she was on the margins of the fringes of modernism. She knew everybody, and she comments in her journalism. A lot of people. There's a column here that I was reading just now where she does a visit to Burl Marx' studio in Leme, in Rio. It's wonderful what she comments about her visit to Burl Marx' studio. She knew Flávio de Carvalho, and with his experiments, she comments a lot. Alcântara de Machado, who I love as well. So we realized that she was known. Murilo Mendes, she knew him quite well, and she comments in her column about Murilo Mendes. And when she was in France as well, she knew the surrealists, as you commented, who appear in her book, being so young, on the fringes in a certain sense. There's her critique, which is persistent and severe, harsh. She doesn't forgo her critique. She's a well-known character. She's a personality. All the modernists and sometimes international modernists knew her. So she's a figure with a much larger dimension than this little girl on the fringes of Brazilian modernism. The impression that I had reading her articles and looking at her trajectory and the themes and the diversity of journals and newspapers, and the amounts. So she was an assiduous journalist. She must have been read much more and much better known at her time than her modernist peers. We know that already. So this is something that we need to understand. It's a detail, an important detail for us. She reached us in a situation that's like a secondary figure in Brazilian modernism. At that time, over the course of those decades, she was a protagonist, much more in a vaster sense, with a greater reach than Oswald de Andrade himself. We know that the discovery, her acknowledgement, her recognition came later. It was every day during her life and consistent. And she revealed herself this issue of her dedication. She dedicated her work against any kind of mediocrity. She never accepted mediocrity. So on theater, for example, her columns on theater, so she's telling things, how things should be done in the theater. In the public in general, she believes in reading, the possibility of each person learning, to learn everything possible. So there are various different columns about the need for reading, to educate herself. She was an educator in that sense, dedicated to this authorial work. So we realize this kind of solidness and firmness through her work, this kind of dedication to the arts, to knowledge and reading, and great figures in art and literature. Her critical activity as a critic, a literary critic, she covers. It's amazing, her span. It took me several days reading. I received a PDF. It's not easy to read in PDF because the book was just published yesterday, and it's an extraordinary experience. She comments on the Serge Millet, in a sense. She's better because she knew the people that she portrays. And he was in Europe, and he was way apart, but certainly her journalism as a critical for newspaper critique. I'm very curious to see these articles, not only in the anthology, but also in the full text, which are going to be published as an ebook by the University of São Paulo's publishing house. But I was curious about her action, this concern. I'm a teacher myself, a professor, and I recall that when she began to write as Mara Lobo, her pen name, she wanted to do a project of a history of Brazilian literature, the history of Brazilian literature. She picks up on authors. She stops and talks about more contemporary things. What about her background? Are there a lot of articles in this sense as her background, her concern, and the fact as her didactic concerns? Because one of the facets which are still in the shadows, right? She was a person who was extremely well informed ever since a very young age, but when she married Ferraz, it must have been one of these couples talking about intellectual themes or things of the world, nonstop. And they welcomed people at their home. The columns that she dedicated to Fernando Pessoa, amongst the first things written about Fernando Pessoa in Brazil, when they fled Portugal, they stayed at their home. So she knew, and they welcomed and received the literary and artistic intellectuals from Europe, especially Portugal. And this was, I believe, especially when we could see this list of writers, 90 different writers that she chose to review. It's fascinating because they're American writers, very young authors, McCullers, other writers, French writers. So very well informed, also wanting to bring these authors to Brazil and translate them for the larger readership to know them. She was not a kind of information that she kept to herself or just talked about at home. She spread it and used it in her journalism because she believed in the value of information. And she translated UNESCO. She valued the theater, the absurd before anyone. So it's important. We know Pagu is a young person, but all this journalistic production of hers, which we perhaps relegated. Subsequent to her life, it was people picked up at him, and it's being reclaimed now. I think of a column. I'm thinking of it. She dedicated to Tarsila do Amaral. Pagu writing about Tarsila. What about that? It's an extremely generous column, very interesting. She loved Tarsila do Amaral, and she had a painting of Tarsila do Amaral. Can't miss it in journalism. It's an unexpected side that we see, and her objectivity and her generosity and her vision of the time above and beyond herself. Adriana, we are moving to the end of the session, the panel, and I think that it's almost a final word in this session. All good things come to an end. Amongst us three, you're the closest person to Pagu of us three. So, obviously, after Professor's going to say farewell with his final words, but I would like for you to tell us a little bit in these closing remarks. Tell us a little bit about Pagu and body, Pagu and affect, Pagu and struggles, contemporary struggles of women. This link between us, between you and Pagu, the contemporary time, the present time, and the contemporaneity that Pagu gives us. I think this is fascinating. Pagu, she traversed the proletarian cause and other minorities, gender issue, but we know that, in fact, the person that brought Pagu to our days were women. It was the feminist movements, etc. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I think you could, right? So, it's always moving to talk from this perspective. I would like to begin saying that Pagu was multifaceted, including all her pseudonyms and pen names. We talk about pen and we talk about her name, which is a name given by a man, Pagu, this nickname. through an equivocal interpretation of her last name, which she denied and rejected at some point, but now we've reclaimed it with all its strength, writing it in a different way. It's that she was Ariel, she was Patsy, she was Mara Lobo. She reclaimed Mara Lobo because Mara Lobo first was a pen name required, or a pseudonym. She reclaimed Mara Lobo. It was a Communist Party that forced it on her, and she used it for her own purposes, although it was originally forced on her by the Communist Party. How she was able, based on all of the constraints, embarrassments, and contradictions, she raised her voice on high. I think that it's a lesson that she gives us, this lesson of courage, this lesson of rewriting this name. And we as readers, it behooves us to move forward with this rewriting and with these names and these new names. All her pen names, pseudonyms, aliases, and so forth. Oftentimes we leave the debates mobilized, enthused by the ideas. I believe and I hope and I'm certain that today we're going to leave here mobilized by the ideas and mobilized by the books that we need to read. We need to read the Pagu's Chronicles, the Professor Adriana Armony's novel, and I'd like to turn the floor over to Professor Jackson for his final remarks. I'd like to talk about humor, oftentimes ironic, sarcastic humor, beginning with the long hair and the man of the people and her concerns. A series of columns that she wrote about the Korean War in the 1950s, where she says, for example, President Truman is not going to give me an atomic bomb, and I needed one even when I needed one. We began flip on our homework. Our homework is 2 huge books. They're different in their design and conception. They're huge books where we can find Pagu in them. I would like, before we conclude this important panel, to remind everyone, invite the audience, the readerships for the autographs in the Flip bookstore, which is happening starting right now. So thank you very much, Adriana, Armony, and thank you, Professor David Jackson. It was a pleasure, huge pleasure.